Chapter 1. A Birth in Troubled Times. In the small, quiet town of Trier, Germany, on May 5, 1818, a baby boy was born. His name was Karl Marx. The world was changing rapidly around him. Old kingdoms were crumbling, and new ideas were spreading like wildfire. This was a time of great uncertainty and excitement. People were questioning the old ways and dreaming of new possibilities. Little did anyone know, this tiny baby, Karl Marx, would grow up to become one of the most influential thinkers in history. Karl was born into a Jewish family, but his life was not as simple as it might seem. His father, Heinrich Marx, was a lawyer, a man who believed in education and reason. Heinrich wanted a better life for his family, and he thought that religion might stand in the way. At that time, in Germany, Jews faced many restrictions and prejudices. They were not allowed to hold certain jobs or live in certain areas. Heinrich wanted to protect his family from this, so he made a bold decision. When Karl was only a child, his father converted to Christianity. This was a big change for the Marx family. And it wasn't just about religion. By becoming Christians, they hoped to fit into society better, to avoid the discrimination that came with being Jewish. But this decision wasn't just practical. It also had a deep impact on Karl. As he grew older, Karl would think a lot about religion, why people believed what they did, and how those beliefs affected their lives. This would be a theme in his later writings. Growing up, Karl was a curious and intelligent boy. He loved to read, to learn about the world. His father encouraged this curiosity, filling their home with books and ideas. Karl was particularly interested in history and in the stories of great thinkers who had come before him. He wanted to understand the world around him, to know why things were the way they were. But Karl wasn't just a quiet bookworm. He was also full of energy and passion. He wanted to change the world, even before he fully understood it. As Karl grew older, the world around him continued to change. The old order was falling apart. New ideas about freedom, equality, and justice were spreading. People were talking about revolution. They wanted to overthrow the old rulers, to create a fairer society. These ideas fascinated Karl, but they also troubled him. He wondered, could these dreams really come true? And what would happen if they did? Karl's family life was comfortable, but not without challenges. His father worked hard to provide for them, but the times were tough. The Marx family, like many others, felt the pressures of the changing world. Sometimes it seemed like everything was uncertain, and the future was full of unknowns. This sense of uncertainty, of living in a world that was always shifting, would stay with Karl for the rest of his life. When Karl was a teenager, he went to school in Trier. He was an excellent student, always at the top of his class, but he wasn't just interested in getting good grades. Karl wanted to learn about everything. He studied literature, philosophy, history, and science. He was especially drawn to the works of the great philosophers, men who asked big questions about life, society, and the universe. Karl wanted to understand these big questions too, and maybe even find some answers. But Karl's school days weren't always easy. He was a bit of a rebel, questioning authority and challenging the rules. His teachers admired his intelligence, but they also worried about his restless spirit. They saw in Karl a young man who was not content with the world as it was, someone who wanted to make things better, even if it meant breaking the rules. This rebellious streak would stay with Karl throughout his life, leading him into both triumph and trouble. After finishing school, Karl went to university. He started in Bonn, a lively city full of students and ideas, but Karl quickly got into trouble there. He spent more time partying and fighting duels than studying. His father was not pleased, and soon Karl was sent to the University of Berlin, a more serious and disciplined place. But even in Berlin, Karl couldn't help but be drawn to the radical ideas that were in the air. In Berlin, Karl was introduced to the philosophy of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, a thinker who believed that history was a process of constant change, a struggle between opposing forces. Hegel's ideas fascinated Karl. He saw in them a way to understand the world's conflicts and transformations. But Karl didn't just want to understand the world, he wanted to change it. He began to think about how Hegel's ideas could be applied to society, to the struggles between rich and poor, powerful and powerless. During this time, Karl became involved with a group of radical thinkers known as the Young Hegelians. These young men were passionate about revolution. They believed that the old ways had to be swept away to make room for something new. They spent long nights debating philosophy, politics, and religion, questioning everything that society took for granted. Karl was in his element. He loved these intense discussions where ideas flew like sparks. But Karl's involvement with the Young Hegelians brought him into conflict with the authorities. The government was watching these young radicals closely. They were afraid of the ideas they were spreading. Soon, Karl's writings and speeches were attracting unwanted attention. He was seen as a troublemaker, someone who was challenging the status quo. This was a dangerous position to be in, and Karl knew it. Despite the risks, Karl continued to push forward. He started writing articles for radical newspapers, using his pen to fight for the ideas he believed in. His words were sharp and powerful. They inspired some people and angered others. But Karl didn't care about making friends. He cared about the truth. He wanted to expose the injustices of the world, to show people that things didn't have to be the way they were. But this was just the beginning of Karl's journey, a journey that would take him far from his home in Trier and into the heart of the revolutionary movements that were shaking Europe. Chapter 2. A Curious Mind. From a very young age, Karl Marx was different. He wasn't just any ordinary child. Karl was curious, always curious. He wanted to know everything about everything. He was the kind of child who would look at the sky and wonder, why is it blue? He would see people working in the fields and ask, why do some people have to work so hard while others do not? These questions buzzed in his mind constantly. They filled him with a restless energy. Karl's father, Heinrich Marx, saw something special in his son. Heinrich was a lawyer, a man of reason and intellect. He valued knowledge and education above all else. He believed that with the right education, Karl could achieve great things. So Heinrich encouraged Karl to study hard, to read books, ask questions, and never stop learning. The Marx household was filled with books, history, philosophy, literature. There was always something new for Karl to explore, and explore he did. At school, Karl was not just a good student, he was brilliant. He quickly became one of the top students in his class. His teachers noticed his sharp mind, his ability to understand complex ideas. But Karl was not satisfied with just getting good grades. He wanted more. He wanted to understand the deeper meaning behind the facts and figures. When the teacher talked about history, Karl wanted to know why things happened the way they did. When they discussed literature, Karl wanted to explore the emotions and ideas behind the words. But Karl's brilliance came with a bit of a rebellious streak. He wasn't content to just sit quietly and accept what he was told. If something didn't make sense to him, or if he thought something was unfair, he would speak up. This sometimes got him into trouble. His teachers admired his intelligence, but they were also a little wary of his questions. Karl wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo, even if it meant making people uncomfortable. This questioning nature only grew stronger as Karl got older. When he was a teenager, he began to read more and more, diving into the works of the great philosophers and thinkers. He read about the ideas of freedom, justice, and equality. He learned about the struggles of the past, about revolutions and the fight for a better world. These ideas fascinated Carl. They lit a fire in his mind. He started to see the world not just as it was, but as it could be. But Carl was not just a dreamer. He was also deeply practical. He wanted to understand how the world worked, so he could find ways to change it. He began to see that the world was full of contradictions, rich and poor, powerful and powerless, free and oppressed. These contradictions puzzled him, and he wanted to understand them fully. He believed that if he could just understand these contradictions, he could find a way to resolve them, to make the world a better place. When Carl went to university, his passion for philosophy grew even stronger. He first attended the University of Bonn, a lively place full of students with big ideas. But Carl's time in Bonn was more about adventure than study. He enjoyed the freedom of university life, maybe a little too much. He joined a drinking club, got into fights, and even participated in duels. His father, Heinrich, was not pleased. He wanted Carl to focus on his studies, not on these distractions. So, after a year, Carl was sent to the University of Berlin, a more serious and disciplined place. In Berlin, Carl found himself surrounded by some of the greatest minds of his time. The university was a center of learning and debate, a place where ideas collided like waves in a stormy sea. Carl was in his element. He dived into his studies with a new sense of purpose. He studied law like his father wanted, but his true passion was philosophy. He spent hours in the library reading the works of the great philosophers, Kant, Fichte, and most importantly, Hegel. Hegel's philosophy had a profound impact on Carl. Hegel believed that history was a process of constant change, a struggle between opposing forces. He called this process dialectics. Hegel's ideas were complex and difficult, but Carl was fascinated by them. He saw in Hegel's dialectics a way to understand the contradictions he saw in the world. He believed that if history was a process of struggle, then it was possible to change the course of history, to shape the future. But Carl was not content to simply study these ideas in the classroom. He wanted to discuss them, to debate them, to test them against the real world. He found a group of like-minded students, and together they formed a circle of young thinkers. They called themselves the Young Hegelians. The Young Hegelians were radicals. They believed that the old ways of thinking had to be challenged, that society needed to be transformed. They spent long nights in heated discussions, questioning everything from religion to politics to philosophy. These debates were not just academic exercises for Carl. He saw them as part of a larger struggle, a struggle to understand the world and find a way to change it. He began to write essays and articles, expressing his ideas and challenging the ideas of others. His writing was powerful and passionate. It caught the attention of both his fellow students and the authorities. The government, which was already nervous about the spread of radical ideas, began to take notice of Carl and his friends. Trouble was brewing. The authorities were not happy with the Young Hegelians. They saw these young thinkers as a threat to the established order. The government began to crack down on radical groups, banning their meetings, censoring their writings, and even arresting some of their members. But this did not deter Carl. If anything, it made him more determined. He saw the government's actions as proof that he and his friends were on the right track. The more the authorities tried to silence him, the louder Carl's voice became. As Carl's ideas developed, he began to see the world in a new way. He started to believe that the contradictions he saw in society were not just random, but were part of a larger system. He began to question the very foundations of society, the way wealth was distributed, the way power was held, the way people were treated. He started to see the world as a place where a few people held all the power, while the majority were oppressed and exploited. This realization would be the foundation of Karl's future work. But Karl's journey was just beginning. He still had much to learn and many struggles ahead. His ideas were still forming, still taking shape. But one thing was clear. Karl Marx was not going to be just another philosopher. He was going to be a thinker who changed the world, a thinker who would leave a lasting impact on history. But how would he do it? What would be the next step on his journey? That is a story for another chapter. A chapter filled with passion, conflict, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Chapter 3. A Rebel with a Cause. At university, Karl Marx was no longer just a curious student. He was becoming something more, a rebel with a cause. Karl was passionate, full of energy, and eager to challenge the world around him. He wasn't content to simply learn about philosophy and history. He wanted to put those ideas into action. He wanted to change the world. Karl quickly found himself in the company of like-minded individuals, a group of young, radical thinkers who were just as restless as he was. These were students and intellectuals who believed that society needed to be transformed. They talked about big ideas, freedom, equality, and justice. They dreamed of a world where everyone had the same rights, where the rich didn't exploit the poor, where there was no oppression. These young radicals were inspired by the works of many philosophers, but none more so than Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel's ideas about history and society, about how change happens through conflict and struggle, resonated deeply with Karl and his friends. They believed that if history was a process of constant change, then it was their duty to push that change forward, to fight against the old ways and create something new. Karl was particularly drawn to these ideas. He saw in them a way to understand the world's problems, and more importantly, a way to solve them. He began to immerse himself in the study of Hegel's works, spending long hours reading and discussing them with his friends. They would gather in cafes, in each other's rooms, anywhere they could talk freely. These discussions were intense, full of passion and energy. For Karl, this was not just about learning, it was about preparing for the future. But not everyone was happy about these gatherings. The authorities were keeping a close eye on Karl and his friends. The government was nervous about the spread of radical ideas. They wanted to maintain control, to keep things the way they were. They saw these young thinkers as a threat, a group of troublemakers who were stirring up dangerous ideas. And in many ways, they were right. Karl's involvement with this group of radicals brought him into conflict with the university administration as well. His professors were not pleased with his rebellious attitude. They saw him as a disruptive influence, someone who was more interested in challenging the rules than following them. Karl's writings and speeches were becoming bolder, more critical of the government, the church, and the university itself. He was not afraid to speak his mind, even if it meant making powerful enemies. Eventually, the tension between Karl and the authorities reached a breaking point. He was forced to leave the University of Bonn, not because of his academic performance, but because of his involvement in these radical activities. This was a devastating blow for Karl. He loved learning, he loved the university environment, and now he was being pushed out, not for failing, but for thinking differently. But Karl was not one to give up easily. With the support of his father, Heinrich, Karl decided to continue his education at the University of Berlin. Berlin was a bigger, more cosmopolitan city with a vibrant intellectual scene. It was a place where Karl hoped he could study in peace, a place where he could find new opportunities to develop his ideas. But Berlin was also a city full of challenges. And Karl's journey was far from over. When Karl arrived in Berlin, he found himself in the midst of a bustling metropolis. The city was full of energy, full of life. There were students and scholars from all over Europe. and the intellectual debates were even more intense than in Bonn. Karl quickly immersed himself in this environment. He was excited to be surrounded by so many ideas, so many different perspectives. At the University of Berlin, Karl continued his studies with a new sense of determination. He was more focused, more serious about his work. He spent long hours in the library, reading everything he could get his hands on. He studied philosophy, history, economics, and politics. But despite his dedication to his studies, Karl couldn't stay away from the world of radical ideas. In Berlin, Karl reconnected with the young Hegelians, the same group of radical thinkers he had been involved with in Bonn. These young men were just as passionate, just as eager to challenge the old ways. They believed that Hegel's ideas could be used to justify a revolution, to overthrow the old social and political order. Karl was inspired by their enthusiasm. He felt like he had found his true calling. Together with the young Hegelians, Karl began to develop his own ideas. He started to see the world in terms of class struggle, a conflict between those who had power and those who did not. He believed that this struggle was the driving force of history, that all the conflicts and changes in society could be understood through this lens. But these ideas were not just academic for Karl, they were personal. He felt a deep connection to the struggles of the poor and oppressed, and he wanted to do something about it. Karl's writings became more radical, more focused on the idea of revolution. He started publishing articles in radical newspapers, criticizing the government, the church, and the capitalist system. His words were sharp, full of passion and conviction. He called for change, for a society where everyone would be equal, where there would be no more exploitation, no more oppression. But the more Karl wrote, the more attention he attracted. And not all of it was positive. The government was watching him closely. They were worried about the influence of his ideas. They saw Karl as a dangerous figure, someone who could inspire others to rise up against the established order. The authorities began to put pressure on him, trying to silence his voice. Despite these challenges, Karl refused to back down. He believed in his ideas, and he was willing to fight for them. He continued to write, to speak out, to challenge the status quo. But his rebellious nature came at a cost. He was once again forced to leave the university. This time, it was clear that his radical ideas had made him too much of a threat. But Karl Marx was not a man who gave up easily. Even though he had been forced to leave his second university, he did not lose hope. He knew that his journey was far from over, that there were still many battles to be fought, many ideas to explore. Berlin had given him a new sense of purpose, a clearer understanding of the world's problems. He was more determined than ever to find a way to change the world. Karl's time in Berlin was a turning point in his life. It was here that he began to develop the ideas that would define his future work. It was here that he fully embraced his role as a rebel, someone who would challenge the world's injustices, no matter the cost. He was ready to take the next step in his journey, a journey that would lead him into even greater struggles, but also into the creation of ideas that would shape the future of the world. As Karl Marx moved forward, he carried with him the lessons he had learned in Berlin, the passion for justice, the commitment to understanding the world's problems, and the unshakable belief that things could be different. He was a rebel with a cause, and that cause would drive him for the rest of his life. But what would come next? What challenges would he face, and how would his ideas continue to develop? The answers to these questions would come in the next chapter of his incredible journey, a journey that would leave a lasting impact on history. Chapter 4. Love and Politics. In the bustling city of Berlin, amid the heated debates and restless energy of student life, Karl Marx met someone who would change his life forever, a young woman named Jenny von Westphalen. Jenny was not like the other women Karl had known. She was beautiful, yes, with striking features and a warm smile. But she was also incredibly smart, a woman of deep thoughts and strong convictions. She came from a noble family, with a background very different from Carl's own. Yet, despite these differences, or maybe because of them, Carl and Jenny fell deeply in love. Their love story began like a dream, but it was not without its challenges. Jenny's family was wealthy and well-connected. They were part of the Prussian aristocracy, while Carl's family, though respectable, was not nearly as influential. Jenny's father, Baron Ludwig von Westphalen, was a high-ranking official, and her social circle was full of important people. Marrying someone like Carl, a rebellious student with radical ideas, was not exactly what her family had in mind. But Jenny was not a typical noblewoman. She was passionate and independent, someone who believed in thinking for herself. She had been raised in a world of privilege, but she was not blind to the injustices around her. When she met Carl, she found in him a kindred spirit, someone who shared her desire to challenge the status quo. Jenny was drawn to Carl's intelligence, his passion, and his unwavering commitment to his ideals. And Carl, in turn, was captivated by Jenny's strength, her beauty, and her willingness to stand by his side, even when it was risky. Their relationship quickly grew serious. Despite the differences in their social status, Carl and Jenny knew that they were meant to be together. They spent hours talking about everything, from politics to philosophy, from dreams of the future to the struggles of the present. Jenny supported Carl in everything he did, even when his ideas were controversial, even when they put him and her at odds with the world around them. But love and politics are not always easy to mix. As Carl's ideas became more radical, life became more difficult. He was determined to change the world, but the world was not ready to be changed. Carl's writings were often censored, his articles banned by the authorities. He found it increasingly difficult to find stable work. He tried his hand at journalism, writing for various radical newspapers, but the government was constantly shutting them down. Every time Carl published something, he risked being silenced. This uncertainty took a toll on their lives. Carl's lack of a steady income made it hard to plan for the future. Marriage was difficult to even consider when there was no guarantee of financial stability. But Carl and Jenny were committed to each other. They knew that their love was stronger than any obstacle. They got engaged, even though they didn't know what the future would hold. They believed that together they could face anything. Jenny's family was not entirely pleased with her choice. They saw Carl as a troublemaker, someone who was more interested in stirring up controversy than in settling down and providing for a family. But Jenny stood firm. She loved Carl, and she believed in him. She believed in his ideas, even when they were dangerous. She was willing to give up her comfortable life, to face the uncertainty and hardship that came with being by Carl's side. Carl, too, knew that he was asking a lot from Jenny. He understood that his life's work would not be easy, that there would be many struggles ahead. But he also knew that he could not imagine his life without her. Jenny was his anchor, his source of strength. She gave him the courage to keep fighting, even when the odds were against him. The early years of their engagement were filled with both joy and frustration. Carl continued to write and speak out, becoming more and more involved in radical politics. He joined various political groups, trying to organize workers and spread his ideas, but the authorities were always one step ahead, watching his every move. The more Carl pushed, the more resistance he faced. He was arrested multiple times, questioned by the police, and even exiled from certain cities. But through it all, Jenny remained by his side. In 1843, Carl and Jenny finally got married. It was a small, private ceremony, far from the grand celebrations that might have been expected for someone of Jenny's social standing. But for them, it was perfect. They were starting their life together, not as aristocrats or intellectuals, but as partners in a shared struggle. They knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but they were ready to face it, together. After their marriage, Carl and Jenny moved to Paris, hoping to find a place where they could live and work in peace. Paris was a city of revolutionaries, a place where ideas were exchanged freely and where radical thinkers like Carl could find a community. But even in Paris, life was not easy. Money was always tight, and Carl's writings continued to attract the attention of the authorities. But for a while, at least, they were able to carve out a life for themselves. In Paris, Carl met Friedrich Engels, a man who would become his lifelong friend and collaborator. Engels was another radical thinker, someone who shared Carl's vision of a world without oppression. With Engels, Carl began to develop the ideas that would later become the foundation of his most famous work, the Communist Manifesto. But these ideas were still taking shape, and the road to their creation was full of challenges. As Carl's ideas became more developed, they also became more controversial. His writings attacked not just the government, but the entire social system. He argued that the capitalist system was inherently unjust, that it created a world where the rich exploited the poor. These ideas were powerful, but they were also dangerous. The authorities in Paris, like those in Germany, were not interested in hearing them. Carl and Jenny's life in Paris was marked by constant struggle. They lived in poverty, often relying on the support of friends and family. They had their first child, a daughter named Jenny, but even this joy was tempered by the harsh realities of their life. Carl continued to write, to speak out, to fight for what he believed in. But the cost was high, both for him and for Jenny. Despite the hardships, Carl and Jenny's love remained strong. They were each other's confidants, supporters, and partners in every sense of the word. Jenny believed in Carl's work. She believed that he was fighting for something bigger than both of them, something that could change the world. And Carl, in turn, drew strength from Jenny's unwavering support. Together, they faced the challenges of life with determination and courage. As the years passed, Carl and Jenny would face many more trials. They would move from city to city, always searching for a place where they could live and work freely. They would experience loss, hardship, and disappointment. But through it all, their love remained a constant, a beacon of hope in a world full of uncertainty. Karl Marx's life was one of struggle, both personal and political. But it was also a life of deep love and partnership. Jenny von Westphalen was not just Karl's wife. She was his equal, his partner in the fight for a better world. Their love story is a reminder that even in the midst of the most intense political battles, there is room for love, for support, and for the kind of partnership that can face any challenge. Chapter 5. A Pen Against Power. Karl Marx had always been a man of ideas, but now those ideas were beginning to take shape in a new and powerful way. After moving to Paris with Jenny, Karl found himself in a city full of energy, a city of revolutionaries, thinkers, and dreamers. Paris was a place where ideas were born and spread like wildfire, and Karl was ready to add his voice to the chorus. But Karl wasn't just another thinker. He had a weapon, a pen, and with it, he would challenge the very foundations of society. Karl began his journey as a journalist, writing for radical newspapers that were not afraid to speak the truth, even when it was dangerous. His articles were sharp, passionate, and full of conviction. He wrote about the injustices he saw around him, the exploitation of workers, the corruption of governments, and the inequality that seemed to be everywhere. Karl's words were like a call to arms. They inspired people to think, to question, and to demand change. But with these powerful words came powerful enemies. The governments of Europe were not happy about Karl's writings. They saw him as a threat, someone who was stirring up trouble, encouraging people to rise up against their rulers. His articles were banned in Germany, and soon it became clear that Karl was not safe. The authorities were watching him closely, and it was only a matter of time before they would try to silence him for good. Fleeing from Germany was not an easy decision. Karl and Jenny had already faced so many challenges: poverty, censorship, and now exile. But they knew they couldn't stay. With heavy hearts, they packed up their lives once again and moved to Paris. Paris was a city of hope, but it was also a city of struggle. Karl and Jenny knew that their journey was far from over. In Paris, Karl continued to write, but now his focus was even sharper. He was not just writing about injustices, he was trying to understand them, to find the root causes. Why were the workers so oppressed? Why did the rich have so much power? And most importantly, what could be done to change it? These questions drove Karl to dive deeper into his studies, to read more, to think more, and to write more. It was in Paris that Karl met a man who would change his life forever: Friedrich Engels. Engels was a fellow thinker, a man who shared Karl's passion for justice and his anger at the state of the world. But Engels was different in some important ways. He came from a wealthy family. He had seen the world of the rich and powerful up close, and he understood how it worked. Engels was also a writer, and like Karl, he used his pen to fight against the injustices he saw around him. The two men quickly became close friends. They spent hours talking, debating, and sharing ideas. Engels had a deep understanding of the economic forces at play in society. He had studied capitalism and seen its effects firsthand. Karl, on the other hand, was more focused on philosophy and history. Together, they realized that their ideas could be combined to create something powerful, something that could truly challenge the status quo. In 1844, Karl and Engels began working on a series of writings that would later become known as the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts. These writings were not just about pointing out the problems of society. They were about understanding them, explaining them, and finding a way to change them. Karl and Engels believed that the world was divided into two main classes: the bourgeoisie, who owned the means of production, and the proletariat, who did the work. They argued that the relationship between these two classes was the key to understanding all of society's problems. But writing about these ideas was not enough. Karl and Engels knew that they needed to spread their ideas, to get them into the hands of the people who could use them to make real change. They continued to write articles, pamphlets, and books, trying to reach as many people as possible. Their writings were passionate and direct. They didn't just describe the world as it was, they called for a revolution to change it. However, their work was constantly under threat. The governments of Europe were cracking down on radical ideas, and Karl and Engels had to be careful. Their writings were often censored, their meetings disrupted, and their supporters harassed. But they refused to be silenced. They knew that their work was important, and they were determined to keep going, no matter the risks. In 1845, the pressure from the authorities became too much. Karl and Jenny were forced to leave Paris. They moved to Brussels, where they hoped to find a safer environment to continue their work. But even in Brussels, the challenges continued. Karl struggled to support his family, as his writing was not enough to provide a steady income. But Jenny stood by him, as she always had. Her faith in Karl never wavered. Despite the hardships, Karl and Engels continued to develop their ideas. In 1848, they published what would become one of the most famous political documents in history, the Communist Manifesto. This short book was a call to action for the working class, a rallying cry for the proletariat to rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie. The manifesto was clear, bold, and uncompromising. It declared that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, and it ended with a powerful message. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. The Communist Manifesto spread quickly, and it had an immediate impact. Across Europe, workers and radicals were inspired by its message. Revolutions broke out in several countries as people took to the streets to demand their rights. But the revolutions were quickly crushed, and the reaction from the authorities was swift and brutal. Once again, Karl and Engels found themselves under attack. The authorities in Brussels were no longer willing to tolerate Karl's presence. He was forced to leave yet another city, this time fleeing to London. London would become Karl's final home, but it would not be a place of peace. Life in London was hard. The Marx family lived in poverty, often struggling just to put food on the table. But despite the hardships, Karl continued to write, continued to fight for his ideas. In London, Karl began work on what would become his most important book, Das Kapital. This book was the culmination of years of study, thought, and struggle. It was a detailed analysis of the capitalist system, a system that Karl believed was fundamentally flawed and destined to collapse. Das Kapital was not just a critique of capitalism. It was a blueprint for understanding the forces that drive the world, and for changing them. But the work on Das Kapital was slow and difficult. Karl was often sick, and the pressure of supporting his family weighed heavily on him. Yet, he never gave up. He knew that his work was important, that it could help future generations understand the world and change it. And through it all, Jenny remained by his side, supporting him in every way she could. Karl Marx's journey was one of constant struggle, a struggle against poverty, against censorship, against exile. But it was also a journey of hope and determination. Karl believed that the world could be changed, that the injustices he saw around him could be overcome. And through his writings, he sought to inspire others to believe the same. Karl's pen was his weapon against power, and through it, he left a legacy that would continue to influence the world long after his death. His ideas would inspire revolutions, movements, and debates for generations to come. But for Karl, the fight was never just about ideas. It was about the people he loved, the world he lived in, and the future he dreamed of. Chapter 6. The Birth of an Idea. In the heart of Paris, amid the bustling streets and lively cafes, Karl Marx found himself in the company of someone who would become his closest friend and most important collaborator, Friedrich Engels. Paris was a city full of energy, a city where ideas flowed as freely as the Seine River. And for Karl and Engels, this city became the birthplace of something extraordinary, an idea that would change the world. Karl and Engels had much in common. They were both passionate about justice, deeply troubled by the poverty and suffering they saw around them. But they also brought different perspectives to their discussions. Engels, with his background in business and industry, had seen firsthand the exploitation of workers in factories. He understood the harsh realities of capitalism, not just in theory, but in practice. Karl, on the other hand, was a philosopher at heart. He had a deep understanding of history and society, and he was always searching for the root causes of the world's problems. Together, they made a powerful team. They spent countless hours talking, discussing the state of the world, the struggles of the working class, and what could be done to change it. Their conversations were intense and filled with emotion. They talked about why so many people were poor, why workers were forced to toil for long hours with little pay, and why the rich seemed to get richer while the poor got poorer. Karl and Engels agreed on one thing: the world was deeply unjust, and something had to be done to change it. But what? They believed that the problems of society were not just the result of bad policies or corrupt leaders. They were the result of a system that was designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. This system, they argued, was capitalism. Capitalism, in their view, was a system that created wealth for a small number of people. The bourgeoisie, who owned the factories, the land, and the resources. Meanwhile, the vast majority of people, the workers or the proletariat, were forced to sell their labor for wages that barely allowed them to survive. This system, Karl and Engels believed, was not just unfair, it was fundamentally broken. As they continued to discuss these ideas, a new understanding began to take shape. They started to see history not as a series of random events, but as a struggle between different classes. The rich and powerful had always found ways to keep the poor and powerless under control. But history showed that these struggles could lead to change. Revolutions, they believed, were the driving force of history, and they were necessary to overthrow the old order and create something new. But Karl and Engels didn't just want to understand the world, they wanted to change it. They believed that the only way to make things better was through revolution. And not just any revolution, a revolution led by the working class, the people who had the most to gain and the least to lose. They imagined a world where the workers would rise up, overthrow their oppressors, and take control of the means of production. In this new world, there would be no more exploitation, no more poverty, no more injustice. These ideas were radical, even revolutionary. But Karl and Engels were convinced that they were necessary. And so, they decided to put their thoughts into writing. They wanted to create a document that would explain their ideas clearly and inspire others to join the cause. They wanted to write something that would not just analyze the problems of the world, but also offer a solution. The result was a small book, a pamphlet really, called the Communist Manifesto. It was published in 1848, a year of revolutions across Europe. The timing could not have been more perfect. People everywhere were demanding change, and the Communist Manifesto gave them a new way to think about their struggles. The manifesto began with a bold statement. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. It was a call to action, a declaration that a new force was rising, one that would challenge the old ways of thinking and bring about a new world. The manifesto went on to describe the history of society as a history of class struggles, the conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It argued that the capitalist system was inherently unstable and that it would inevitably be replaced by a socialist system where the workers would control the means of production. But the manifesto was not just a theoretical document. It was a call to arms. It ended with a powerful message. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. These words were a rallying cry, urging the workers to take their destiny into their own hands, to rise up and overthrow the system that kept them oppressed. The Communist Manifesto spread quickly. It was translated into many languages and distributed across Europe. For many, it was like a breath of fresh air, a new way of thinking about their struggles, a new hope for the future. But for others, it was deeply threatening. The governments of Europe were terrified of the ideas in the manifesto. They saw it as a dangerous document, one that could incite revolution and destabilize their power. And indeed, revolutions did break out across Europe in 1848. In France, Germany, Italy, and beyond, people took to the streets demanding change. They were tired of living under oppressive regimes, tired of being poor while the rich lived in luxury. They wanted a better life, and for a moment, it seemed like the revolution might succeed. But the forces of the old order were strong. The revolutions were crushed, and the governments reasserted their control. Many of the leaders of these uprisings were arrested, exiled, or worse. The dream of a workers' revolution seemed to be over, at least for the time being. For Karl and Engels, this was a difficult time. They had hoped that the revolutions would lead to a new world, but instead they saw their ideas under attack. They were forced to flee yet again, this time to London. But even in the face of these setbacks, they did not give up. They continued to believe in their ideas, to write, to organize, and to inspire others. The Communist Manifesto may not have led to immediate revolution, but it planted a seed. The ideas in that small book would continue to grow, to spread, and to influence people all over the world. It became one of the most important political documents in history, shaping the course of the 20th century and beyond. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels had given birth to an idea that would challenge the world and inspire millions. But their journey was far from over. The struggle for a better world continued, and Karl and Engels would remain at the forefront of that struggle, always pushing forward, always believing that a new world was possible. Before we dive into Chapter 7, a quick reminder. If you're enjoying this story about Karl Marx and finding it helpful, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment. Your feedback is valuable and helps us create more content for learners like you. Thank you for listening to Woo English. Now, let's continue with Chapter 7. Chapter 7. A Life in Exile. The publication of the Communist Manifesto in 1848 was like a lightning bolt. It sent shockwaves across Europe. The governments of the time were terrified. They saw the ideas in the manifesto as a direct threat to their power, a call to revolution that could overthrow the old order. Karl Marx had become a marked man, known as a dangerous radical who wanted to upend society. The authorities were determined to silence him. And so, Karl's life became one of constant movement, always one step ahead of those who wanted to stop him. After the revolutions of 1848 were crushed, Karl and his family were forced to leave Paris. The city had been a hub of revolutionary activity, but now it was too dangerous. The French government was cracking down on radicals, and Karl was at the top of their list. With Jenny and their children, Karl fled to Brussels, hoping to find safety and a place to continue his work. But even in Belgium, the authorities were watching. Karl's reputation as a revolutionary thinker followed him wherever he went. In Brussels, Karl continued to write and organize, but it wasn't long before he was forced to move again. The Belgian government, under pressure from other European powers, expelled him from the country. Karl had become a man without a home, a political exile. The only place left for him to go was London, a city that had become a refuge for many political exiles from across Europe. London would become Karl's final home, but life there was far from easy. When Karl, Jenny, and their children arrived in the city, they were nearly destitute. London was a vast industrial city, full of wealth and poverty side by side. For the Marx family, it was a struggle just to survive. They lived in cramped, dirty conditions, often unable to afford even the basics. Their children were frequently sick, and the family faced constant financial hardship. Despite these challenges, Karl refused to give up. He continued to write, driven by his belief that his ideas could change the world. But it was a lonely and difficult road. In London, Karl had few friends and many enemies. His writings were often banned, and publishers were hesitant to work with someone who was seen as such a controversial figure. But Karl was determined. He believed that the ideas he had developed with Friedrich Engels, ideas about class struggle, capitalism, and revolution, were too important to abandon. Karl spent long hours in the British Museum's reading room, poring over books and documents, researching the workings of capitalism. He was trying to understand how the system worked at its core and how it could be changed. This research would eventually lead to his most important work, Das Kapital, a detailed analysis of the capitalist system. But the road to completing this book was long and full of obstacles. Money was always a problem. The Marx family often depended on the generosity of friends, especially Friedrich Engels, who supported them financially whenever he could. Engels, who was still working in his family's business, sent money to Karl regularly, even though he shared Karl's frustrations with the slow progress of their revolutionary goals. Without Engels' help, it is likely that Karl would not have been able to continue his work. The strain of poverty weighed heavily on Karl and Jenny. They had lost several children to illness, and those who survived were often sickly. The constant worry about how to feed and clothe their family took a toll on their health and spirits. But through it all, Jenny remained Karl's steadfast partner. She believed in him and his work, even when it seemed like the world was against them. In London, Karl was largely isolated from the revolutionary movements that had once energized him. The failure of the 1848 revolutions had been a bitter blow, and the years that followed were marked by disappointment and frustration. Many of the people who had been part of the revolutionary movements had either given up or been silenced. But Karl never lost his faith in the possibility of change. He continued to correspond with revolutionaries across Europe, offering his support and advice whenever he could. Karl's writings during this period were often critical and pessimistic. He wrote about the failures of the revolutions, the corruption of the capitalist system, and the suffering of the working class. But he also wrote with hope, the hope that one day the workers of the world would rise up and take control of their own destinies. He believed that history was on their side, that the contradictions of capitalism would eventually lead to its downfall. As the years went by, Karl's health began to deteriorate. The long hours of work, combined with the stress of poverty and the loss of several children, took a heavy toll on him. But even as his body weakened, his mind remained sharp. He continued to write and revise Das Kapital, determined to complete the work that he believed would expose the flaws of capitalism and offer a vision for a different kind of society. In 1867, the first volume of Das Kapital was finally published. It was the result of years of research, thought, and struggle. The book was a detailed critique of the capitalist system, examining how wealth was produced and distributed and how the system inevitably led to the exploitation of workers. Karl believed that this book would help people understand the forces that shaped their lives and inspire them to fight for a better future. But the publication of Das Kapital did not bring immediate change. The book was dense and difficult, and its impact was not felt right away. Karl continued to work on the second and third volumes, but he was never able to complete them in his lifetime. The struggle to finish Das Kapital was a constant battle against time, illness, and poverty. Life in exile was a hard and lonely existence for Karl Marx. He had dreamed of leading a revolution, of seeing the workers of the world rise up and create a new society. But instead, he spent his final years in a small, crowded apartment in London, far from the centers of power. Yet, despite the hardships, Karl never lost his belief in the power of his ideas. He continued to write, to think, and to dream of a world where people could live free from exploitation and oppression. Karl's life in exile was a testament to his determination and resilience. He faced tremendous challenges, but he never gave up on his vision for a better world. Even when he was forced to live in poverty, even when his work was ignored or rejected, he kept going. He believed that the fight for justice was worth the sacrifice, even if he didn't live to see the results. In the years after Karl's death in 1883, his ideas would spread far beyond the small circles of revolutionaries he had known in life. Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto would inspire movements, revolutions, and debates across the globe. Karl Marx had lived a life of exile, but his ideas would not be confined. They would go on to challenge the world in ways that even he might not have imagined. Chapter 8. A Friend in Need. Karl Marx was a man of many ideas, ideas that could change the world. But even the most brilliant minds need support, especially during difficult times. For Karl, that support came from a true friend, Friedrich Engels. Engels was not just a collaborator, he was a lifeline, someone who stood by Karl through the darkest moments of his life. Without Engels, it's possible that Karl's greatest work, Das Kapital, might never have been completed. Friedrich Engels was a man of contrasts. On one hand, he was a successful businessman, a partner in his family's textile business. On the other hand, he was a committed revolutionary, someone who believed deeply in the same ideals as Karl Marx. Engels had seen the horrors of the Industrial Revolution firsthand. He had witnessed the suffering of workers in the factories and the crushing weight of poverty. This experience shaped his worldview and brought him and Karl together. The friendship between Karl and Engels began in Paris, where they first met and discovered their shared passion for justice and social change. They quickly became close friends, united by their desire to understand the world and make it a better place. But while Karl's path led him deeper into poverty and struggle, Engels found himself in a position to help. Engels was not just a friend, he was also Karl's greatest supporter. Financially, he provided the means for Karl and his family to survive during the most challenging years of their lives. While Karl's writings were powerful, they did not bring in much money. Radical ideas were not exactly profitable, and Karl's work was often banned or censored. This left the Marx family in a precarious situation, always struggling to make ends meet. Engels, who had a steady income from his business, did not hesitate to share what he had. He sent regular financial support to Karl, sometimes in the form of money, sometimes in the form of goods. It wasn't just a matter of charity. Engels believed in Karl's work. He understood that Karl's writings could change the world, and he was willing to do whatever it took to help those ideas come to life. But the relationship between Karl and Engels was not one-sided. They were true collaborators, constantly exchanging ideas, debating theories, and working together to refine their understanding of the world. They spent hours discussing economics, politics, and history, trying to piece together the puzzle of how society worked. Engels brought a practical perspective to their discussions, informed by his experience in the business world, while Karl contributed his deep philosophical insights. Together, they embarked on what would become the most ambitious project of their lives, Das Kapital. This book was meant to be more than just a critique of capitalism. It was a comprehensive analysis of the entire economic system. Karl wanted to explain how capitalism worked at its core, how it created wealth for a few while leaving the majority in poverty, and why it was ultimately doomed to fail. But writing Das Kapital was a long and difficult process. Karl's health was poor, and the pressure of supporting his family weighed heavily on him. The work required an immense amount of research, countless hours spent studying economic theory, historical data, and the operations of industry. Karl was meticulous, determined to get every detail right. He wanted to create a work that would stand the test of time, a book that would be both scientifically rigorous and politically powerful. During this time, Engels was more than just a financial supporter. He was deeply involved in the writing process, offering feedback, suggestions, and even writing sections of the book himself. Engels' knowledge of economics and industry was invaluable, helping Karl to refine his arguments and clarify his ideas. Their collaboration was a true partnership, built on mutual respect and a shared vision for the future. But the process was not without its frustrations. The writing of Das Kapital stretched on for years, far longer than either Karl or Engels had anticipated. There were times when the work seemed overwhelming, when the sheer complexity of the subject matter threatened to derail the entire project. Karl struggled with self-doubt, wondering if he would ever be able to finish the book. But Engels was always there, encouraging him to keep going, reminding him of the importance of their work. Finally, in 1867, the first volume of Das Kapital was published. It was a monumental achievement, the result of years of hard work and collaboration. The book was a detailed critique of the capitalist system, examining how it functioned, how it exploited workers, and how it inevitably led to crises and instability. Karl argued that capitalism was inherently unsustainable. that it would eventually collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The publication of Das Kapital was a major milestone in Karl's life, but it was also just the beginning. The book was dense and complex, not an easy read for most people. Its immediate impact was limited, but Karl and Engels believed that its ideas would spread over time, influencing future generations of thinkers, activists, and revolutionaries. But even after the publication of the first volume, Karl's work was not done. He continued to work on the second and third volumes of Das Kapital, though his health made progress slow and difficult. Once again, Engels was there to support him, both financially and intellectually. Engels took on more of the writing and editing work as Karl's health declined, ensuring that the project would continue even as Karl's strength faded. Throughout these years, Engels' loyalty and dedication never wavered. He believed in Karl's vision and was willing to make sacrifices to help bring it to fruition. Without Engels, it is likely that Das Kapital would never have been completed. Their friendship was a testament to the power of collaboration, to the idea that great ideas are often the result of people working together, supporting each other, and pushing each other to be their best. Karl's friendship with Engels was one of the most important relationships of his life. It was a partnership that produced some of the most influential ideas in modern history. Ideas that would go on to shape the world in ways that neither of them could have fully predicted. Their collaboration on Das Kapital was not just a meeting of minds. It was a meeting of hearts, a shared commitment to a cause that they both believed in deeply. As we continue to follow Karl Marx's journey, we will see how the ideas developed in Das Kapital began to spread, how they influenced movements around the world, and how Karl's legacy was shaped by his friendship with Engels. The story of Karl Marx is not just the story of a man, it is the story of a partnership, a story of two friends who believed that together they could change the world. Chapter 9. The Struggle to Finish. Karl Marx was a man driven by ideas, powerful ideas that he believed could change the world. But even the strongest of wills can be tested by the hardships of life. As Karl worked on Das Kapital, the book that would become his most famous work, he faced struggles that would have broken many others. Yet, despite everything, despite the illness, the poverty, the heartbreaking loss of his children, Karl refused to give up. Das Kapital was not just another book for Karl. It was the culmination of years of thought, study, and passion. He believed that if he could explain how the capitalist system worked, if he could lay bare its inner workings, its flaws, and its injustices, then people would understand why change was necessary. He wanted to create a work that would not only criticize capitalism, but also provide a scientific foundation for future revolutions. But writing Das Kapital was no easy task. It required intense focus, deep research, and long hours of work. Karl spent days and nights in the British Museum's reading room, surrounded by stacks of books and papers, trying to piece together the complex puzzle of economics. He studied everything from history to philosophy to the latest economic theories, all in an effort to create a comprehensive analysis of the capitalist system. However, life kept getting in the way. Karl's health was always fragile. He suffered from a variety of ailments, including severe headaches, liver problems, and skin conditions that caused him constant pain. These illnesses often left him bedridden, unable to work for weeks at a time. But even when he was too sick to write, Karl's mind kept turning over the ideas he wanted to express. He was always thinking, always planning. The Marx family's poverty also weighed heavily on Karl. They lived in a small, cramped apartment in London, often struggling to afford even the most basic necessities. There were times when they had no money for food, and their clothes were worn and tattered. The family depended on the financial support of Friedrich Engels, Karl's loyal friend and collaborator, but even this was not always enough. The stress of poverty was constant, gnawing at Karl and Jenny, his wife, as they tried to provide for their children. The children, They were the light of Karl's life, but also the source of his deepest pain. One by one, he watched as his beloved children fell ill and died. The loss of his daughters, Jennikin and Franziska, broke Karl's heart. He felt helpless, unable to protect them from the harsh realities of their world. The grief was overwhelming, and it threatened to consume him. But even in the depths of his sorrow, Karl knew that he had to keep going. He believed that his work could make a difference, that it could help future generations live in a world where such suffering was no longer necessary. The years dragged on, and the work on Das Kapital moved slowly. Every time Karl thought he was close to finishing, something would happen to set him back. A new illness, a financial crisis, or a political event would throw his life into chaos, forcing him to put the work aside. There were moments of despair when it seemed like the book might never be completed, when the obstacles seemed too great. But Karl's determination was unshakable. He knew that this book was his life's work, and he refused to abandon it. In 1867, after nearly 2 decades of struggle, the first volume of Das Kapital was finally published. It was a monumental achievement, a work of immense scope and detail. In it, Karl dissected the capitalist system, showing how it was driven by the pursuit of profit at the expense of the working class. He explained how labor was exploited, how wealth was accumulated by the few, and how crises were an inevitable part of the system. It was a powerful critique, grounded in deep analysis and supported by historical evidence. The publication of Das Kapital was a moment of triumph for Karl, but it was also bittersweet. He knew that there was still much work to be done. The first volume was only the beginning. Karl had planned to write 2 more volumes to complete his analysis of capitalism, but his health was failing, and the constant pressures of life made it difficult to focus on the work. He continued to write, but progress was slow, and the years of struggle had taken their toll. Despite the challenges, Karl never lost sight of the importance of his work. He believed that Das Kapital could help future generations understand the world, that it could be a tool for those who sought to change it. He knew that he might not live to see the full impact of his ideas, but he was driven by a sense of duty, a belief that his work was part of something larger than himself. Karl's determination was matched by his belief in the power of knowledge. He understood that ideas could be a force for change, that they could inspire people to think differently, to question the world around them, and to fight for a better future. Das Kapital was his contribution to that fight, a weapon in the struggle for justice and equality. As the years passed, Karl continued to work on the remaining volumes of Das Kapital, but his health continued to decline. He struggled with chronic pain and frequent bouts of illness, and his ability to concentrate on his work diminished. But even as his body weakened, his mind remained sharp. He continued to correspond with revolutionaries around the world, offering his insights and advice, always hoping that his work would contribute to the cause of freedom and equality. In the end, Karl was not able to complete the 2nd and 3rd volumes of Das Kapital during his lifetime. After his death in 1883, Friedrich Engels took on the task of editing and publishing the remaining volumes, using the notes and drafts that Karl had left behind. Engels knew how important this work was to Karl, and he was determined to see it through to completion. The publication of the first volume of Das Kapital was a major milestone in the history of political thought. While its immediate impact was limited, its ideas would go on to shape the development of socialist and communist movements around the world. Karl's analysis of capitalism provided a foundation for those who sought to challenge the system and build a more just and equitable society. Karl Marx's struggle to finish Das Kapital was a testament to his dedication and resilience. He faced immense challenges, both personal and political, but he never lost sight of his goal. He believed that his work could make a difference, that it could help people understand the world and inspire them to change it. As we reflect on Karl Marx's life and work, we see a man who was driven by a deep sense of purpose. He faced unimaginable hardships, but he never gave up on his vision of a better world. His legacy lives on in the ideas he developed, ideas that continue to influence the way we think about society, economics, and justice. Chapter 10. The Legacy of a Thinker. As Karl Marx grew older, the fire that once burned so brightly within him began to dim. Not because his ideas had lost their power, but because his body was weakening. The man who had spent decades challenging the world, questioning the status quo, and dreaming of a better future, was now facing the inevitable decline that comes with age. But even as his health failed him, Karl's mind remained as sharp as ever. His ideas, those revolutionary thoughts that had sparked movements and inspired countless others, still held the potential to change the world. Karl spent his final years in London, the city that had become his home in exile. It was a place of both refuge and hardship. He lived in a modest, often cramped apartment, surrounded by books and papers, the tools of his lifelong work. London was a city teeming with life, full of people from all walks of life, yet Karl's world had grown smaller. His days were spent writing, reading, and corresponding with revolutionaries from around the globe. The physical world around him may have shrunk, but his intellectual world was vast, filled with ideas that stretched far beyond the confines of his room. The struggle to complete Das Kapital weighed heavily on Karl during these years. He knew that his time was running out, that his health was deteriorating faster than he could finish the work he had devoted his life to. The first volume of Das Kapital had been published, but there were still 2 more volumes to complete. These volumes were not just additional chapters, they were essential to the full understanding of his critique of capitalism. But progress was slow, painfully slow. His body, once able to endure long hours of study and writing, now betrayed him with frequent illnesses and bouts of exhaustion. Yet Karl pressed on. He would often be found at his desk, surrounded by piles of notes, drafts, and books. His writing was interrupted by fits of coughing, headaches, and pain, but he refused to stop. He believed that the work he was doing was too important, that it had the power to change the course of history. He was driven by a sense of responsibility, a duty to the future generations who would one day take up the cause he had championed for so long. During these final years, Karl maintained a steady correspondence with revolutionaries and thinkers around the world. His letters were full of advice, encouragement, and sometimes stern warnings. He followed the political developments in Europe and beyond with keen interest, offering his insights and predictions. He knew that the world was changing, even if the changes were slow and often painful. He believed that the seeds of revolution had been planted, and that one day the workers of the world would rise up to create a society free from oppression and exploitation. But Karl also knew that he might not live to see that day, and that was a heavy burden to bear. He had spent his entire life fighting for a cause that he believed in with all his heart, yet he understood that the fruits of his labor might only be realized long after he was gone. This realization brought a certain sadness, a sense of unfinished business, but it also gave him a kind of peace. He knew that his ideas would live on, that they would continue to inspire others, and that his work would not be in vain. As his health continued to decline, Karl leaned more and more on his close friends and family, especially Friedrich Engels. Engels, who had been Karl's steadfast companion and collaborator for so many years, was there to support him through the toughest times. Engels took on more of the work of editing and preparing Karl's manuscripts for publication, ensuring that the ideas they had developed together would be preserved and shared with the world. Karl's relationship with his family was also a source of both comfort and pain in these final years. He was deeply attached to his daughters, who had grown into strong, intelligent women. They shared their father's passion for justice and were often involved in political activities themselves. But the losses he had suffered, the children who had died before their time, weighed heavily on him. The grief of those losses never fully left him, and it was a sorrow that he carried with him to the end. In March 1883, Karl Marx passed away quietly in his London home. He was 64 years old. His death was a moment of deep sorrow for those who knew him, but it was also a time of reflection on the immense legacy he left behind. Karl had not lived to see the revolution he dreamed of, but his ideas had already begun to spread far and wide. The seeds he had planted were taking root, and his work would continue to influence the world in profound ways. Karl Marx's death marked the end of a life filled with struggle, sacrifice, and unyielding commitment to a cause. But it was also the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter in which his ideas would take on a life of their own. Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto would go on to inspire generations of activists, thinkers, and revolutionaries. The concepts of class struggle, surplus value, and the critique of capitalism became central to the political discourse of the 20th century. In the years following his death, Karl's ideas were adopted by socialist and communist movements around the world. His work became a foundation for the development of Marxist theory, which would play a central role in the revolutions and political struggles of the 20th century. From the Russian Revolution of 1917 to the various movements for workers' rights and social justice, Karl's influence was felt across the globe. But Karl's legacy is not without controversy. The ideas he developed have been interpreted in many different ways, some of which he might not have recognized or supported. The political movements that claimed to follow his teachings often took his ideas in directions he had not intended. Some regimes that identified as Marxist or communist committed acts of oppression and violence that contradicted the very principles of equality and justice that Karl had fought for. These complexities have led to ongoing debates about the true meaning and impact of Karl Marx's work. Yet, despite these debates, one thing is clear. Karl Marx was a thinker who changed the world. His ideas challenged the status quo, offering a new way of understanding society and the forces that shape it. He provided a powerful critique of capitalism, one that continues to resonate in discussions about inequality, exploitation, and social justice. Karl's work also serves as a reminder of the importance of questioning the world around us, of not accepting things as they are simply because they have always been that way. His life was a testament to the power of ideas and the impact that a single individual can have on the world. As we reflect on the life and legacy of Karl Marx, we see a man who, despite the many challenges he faced, remained committed to his vision of a better world. His ideas have inspired millions, sparked revolutions, and shaped the course of history. The story of Karl Marx is not just the story of a man. It is the story of a thinker whose ideas continue to influence the world we live in today. Chapter 11. The Final Days. The year was 1881, and a deep sadness settled over Karl Marx's home in London. His beloved wife, Jenny, the woman who had stood by him through every trial and hardship, had passed away. Her death was a crushing blow to Karl. They had shared so much together: dreams, struggles, triumphs, and tragedies. Now, without her, the world felt emptier, darker. Jenny had been more than just a wife. She was Karl's closest confidant, his partner in every sense. Losing her was like losing a part of himself. Karl had always been a strong man, enduring years of poverty, exile, and illness. But Jenny's death seemed to drain the last of his strength. He was no longer the fiery revolutionary who had once challenged the world. He was an old man, tired and frail. His health, which had been declining for years, worsened rapidly after Jenny's passing. The pain of losing her was almost too much to bear. But Carl knew he had to keep going. There was still work to be done. The last 2 years of Carl's life were marked by a profound loneliness. His children, those who had survived the harsh conditions of their early years, were a source of comfort. But nothing could fill the void left by Jenny. Carl spent his days quietly, often lost in thought, reflecting on the life he had lived and the work he had done. He continued to write, though his pace had slowed considerably. Every word, every sentence seemed to take more effort than before. Carl's health continued to deteriorate. He suffered from chronic bronchitis, which made breathing difficult, and he was often bedridden for days at a time. Despite this, he remained intellectually active, keeping up with the latest political developments and corresponding with revolutionaries around the world. He believed, even in his final days, that his ideas could help shape the future, that the struggles he had devoted his life to were far from over. In early 1883, Carl's health took a turn for the worse. He became gravely ill, and it was clear to those around him that the end was near. On March 14, 1883, at the age of 64, Karl Marx passed away quietly in his London home. His death marked the end of a life filled with passion, struggle, and an unyielding commitment to justice. Carl was buried next to Jenny in London's Highgate Cemetery, a resting place for many radicals and intellectuals. The funeral was a modest affair, attended by only a few close friends and family members. There were no grand speeches or public displays of mourning, just a simple farewell to a man who had spent his life fighting for what he believed in. As Carl was laid to rest, those who attended the funeral knew that his work was far from finished. His ideas, which had challenged the foundations of society, would continue to live on. They would inspire future generations to think critically about the world, to question the systems of power and oppression, and to fight for a better, more just society. The world that Karl Marx left behind was very different from the one he had envisioned. The revolutions he had hoped for had not come to pass, and the capitalist system he had critiqued remained firmly in place. But Karl's influence could not be measured in immediate results. His work was the beginning of something much larger, a movement that would grow and evolve over time. In the years following Karl's death, his ideas began to spread more widely. Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto were translated into numerous languages and studied by thinkers and activists around the world. His analysis of capitalism, with its focus on class struggle and the exploitation of labor, became a cornerstone of socialist and communist thought. Movements and political parties inspired by Karl's work began to emerge in Europe and beyond, each interpreting his ideas in different ways. But Karl's legacy is a complex one. While his ideas inspired movements for workers' rights, social justice, and political change, they were also used to justify regimes that committed acts of oppression and violence. The governments that claimed to follow Karl's teachings often took his ideas in directions he had not intended, leading to outcomes that were far from the ideals of equality and justice that he had envisioned. This has led to ongoing debates about the true meaning and impact of Karl Marx's work. Yet, despite these controversies, Karl Marx remains one of the most influential thinkers in history. His ideas continue to shape discussions about economics, politics, and society. His critique of capitalism is still relevant today, as people around the world grapple with issues of inequality, exploitation, and the concentration of wealth and power. Whether one agrees with his conclusions or not, it is impossible to deny the impact that Karl Marx has had on the world. In reflecting on Karl's life, it is clear that he was a man of deep conviction, someone who was willing to endure great hardship for the sake of his beliefs. He faced exile, poverty, and personal tragedy, yet he never wavered in his commitment to the cause of social justice. He believed in the power of ideas, the power to change the way people think, to inspire them to take action, and to create a better world. Karl's story is also a reminder of the importance of perseverance. His life was filled with setbacks and challenges, but he continued to work tirelessly, even when the odds were against him. He knew that the changes he sought might not happen in his lifetime, but he was willing to lay the groundwork for future generations. His belief in the possibility of a better world gave him the strength to keep going, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. As we consider the final days of Karl Marx, we see a man who, despite his many hardships, remained dedicated to his vision of a just society. His ideas have endured, continuing to inspire debate, discussion, and action around the world. Karl Marx's legacy is not just the story of a man. It is the story of a thinker whose ideas continue to challenge us, to push us to think critically about the world we live in, and to strive for a future where all people can live free from oppression and inequality. Chapter 12. The Impact of Marx. After Karl Marx passed away in 1883, it might have seemed like the end of his story. But in reality, it was just the beginning. His ideas, which he had worked so hard to develop throughout his life, began to spread across the globe, inspiring revolutions, movements, and debates that would shape the 20th century and beyond. The story of Karl Marx is not just the story of a man. It's the story of an idea that refuses to die. Karl's writings, especially the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, became the foundation for a new way of thinking about society, economics, and politics. His critique of capitalism, with its focus on the exploitation of the working class and the concentration of wealth and power, resonated with people who were struggling under oppressive systems. His ideas offered a framework for understanding the world and, more importantly, for changing it. In the years following Karl's death, socialist and communist movements began to take shape across Europe and around the world. These movements were inspired by Karl's vision of a society where the working class would rise up, overthrow the ruling class, and create a system based on equality and justice. For many, Karl Marx was seen as a hero, a champion of the working class, a man who had dedicated his life to fighting for the rights of the oppressed. One of the most significant moments in the spread of Karl's ideas came in 1917 with the Russian Revolution. The revolution was led by Vladimir Lenin, a man who had been deeply influenced by Karl's writings. Lenin and his fellow revolutionaries believed that the time had come to put Karl's ideas into practice. They overthrew the Russian monarchy and established the world's first socialist state, the Soviet Union. The revolution sent shockwaves around the world. It was seen as proof that Karl's ideas could be realized, that a new world was possible. But with this new world came new challenges. The Soviet Union, and later other countries that adopted Marxist ideas, faced the difficult task of building a socialist society in a world still dominated by capitalism. The reality of implementing Karl's ideas was complex and fraught with difficulties. Some saw the Soviet Union as the fulfillment of Karl's dream, a beacon of hope for workers everywhere. Others, however, saw it as a distortion of his ideas, a system that, instead of liberating people, led to new forms of oppression and dictatorship. Throughout the 20th century, Karl's ideas continued to inspire movements for social change. In China, Mao Zedong led a revolution that resulted in the establishment of the People's Republic of China, another state built on Marxist principles. In Cuba, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara were inspired by Marxism as they fought to overthrow a corrupt regime and establish a socialist state. Across Latin America, Africa, and Asia, Karl's ideas fueled movements for independence, workers' rights, and social justice. But Karl Marx's legacy is not without controversy. The governments that claimed to follow his teachings often took his ideas in directions he might not have intended. Some regimes that identified as Marxist or communist committed acts of violence and repression that contradicted the very principles of equality and justice that Karl had fought for. This has led to ongoing debates about how his ideas should be interpreted and applied. Despite these controversies, Karl Marx's influence cannot be denied. His ideas have shaped the way people think about economics, politics, and society. His analysis of capitalism has been used to understand the workings of modern economies, to critique the concentration of wealth and power, and to argue for policies that promote social justice. Even in countries that did not adopt Marxist ideologies, his ideas have had a profound impact on political thought and policy making. Karl's influence extends beyond politics and economics. His ideas have also shaped discussions in fields such as sociology, history, and philosophy. The concept of class struggle, which is central to Karl's analysis, has become a key tool for understanding social dynamics. His work has influenced countless thinkers, from philosophers to activists, who have used his ideas to explore issues of power, inequality, and social change. In the academic world, Karl's writings continue to be studied and debated. Scholars analyze his works, seeking to understand the complexities of his thought and the implications of his ideas. Debates about Karl's legacy often focus on whether his ideas are still relevant in the modern world. Some argue that his critique of capitalism remains as valid as ever, especially in light of ongoing issues such as economic inequality, corporate power, and environmental degradation. Others contend that his ideas need to be reinterpreted or even set aside in the face of new challenges. One of the reasons Karl's ideas have endured is that they speak to fundamental issues that are still present in society today. The gap between the rich and the poor, the concentration of power in the hands of a few, the exploitation of workers. These are issues that continue to resonate with people around the world. Karl's work provides a lens through which to view these issues, to understand their roots, and to imagine alternatives. But Karl's legacy is also a reminder of the dangers of dogmatism. The history of the 20th century shows that the attempt to implement his ideas on a large scale can lead to unintended consequences, including new forms of oppression. This has led to a more nuanced understanding of Karl's work, one that recognizes both its strengths and its limitations. In the end, the story of Karl Marx is not just the story of a man who lived in the 19th century. It is the story of an idea that has continued to evolve and influence the world long after his death. It is a story of hope, struggle, and the ongoing quest for justice. Karl's ideas have inspired people to fight for a better world, but they have also led to deep and often difficult questions about how that world should be built. As we reflect on the impact of Karl Marx, we see a thinker who dared to challenge the way people viewed the world, who asked questions that few others were willing to ask. His legacy is one of both inspiration and caution, a reminder that ideas can change the world, but that they must be handled with care. Karl Marx's story is far from over. His ideas continue to live on, to be debated, studied, and applied in new ways. They have become a part of the global conversation about how we should live, work, and organize our societies. The impact of Marx is not just a chapter in history. It is an ongoing story, one that will continue to unfold as long as people seek to understand and improve the world around them. And so, as we close this final chapter, we remember Karl Marx not just as a man, but as a thinker whose ideas have left an indelible mark on the world, a mark that continues to shape the course of history and the future that lies ahead.